Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. came to speak with students in the Literary Media and Communications Department at Duke Ellington School of the Arts on June of 2012, after an invitation from Kara Racine, a graduating senior who knows him as a close friend of her family. Gates is an Alphonse Fletcher University professor at Harvard University, as well as director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research. He is the author of Faces of America, which expands on interviews he conducted for his critically acclaimed PBS documentary series of the same name. In this video, Kara recounts his visit, highlighting moments where he reveals to students his passion and inspiration for becoming a writer.
Good question. I mean, I kind of came in knowing that I really liked to write in freshman year, but I didn't really know what I liked to write. I didn't really know. I knew, I guess, the fundamentals, like stuff with grammar and I guess how to spell correctly, but I didn't really know a lot about it. So I kind of got into it and I kind of developed a love for creative fiction and nonfiction. I developed a love for playwriting, and also I kind of dabbled in media studies, which was great. So I got exposure to a little bit of everything. Yeah, what a lot of people don't know about him is he's from a small town in West Virginia, and that's actually how he and my mom met. They both went to an Episcopal church camp, and they started as campers and kind of worked their way up to counselors, and they became best friends, really. And my mom has always kind of, talked about him and told a lot of funny stories about him. And I hadn't really met him until kind of later in my life, and but ever since we've met, we really hit it off, and he's kind of become like an uncle to me. He's always been kind of the godfather who would write to me and ask how I'm doing and call me and everything, but now he's really become more of an uncle, really, very close. He took my mom and I out to dinner in my junior year, and we were sitting at dinner, and I was telling him all about LMC and how much I loved it and what I was doing, and then I said, hey, actually a really good idea would be if you ever had time, you could come in and talk, because my teachers are actually big fans of yours, and they really, really would love to meet you. So that kind of got the ball rolling on it. It took a little while for him to come in because he has a very busy schedule. He's always on the move doing something, and he's always out of the country, and he's just all over the place. But he finally finally came in after much scheduling and rescheduling, and overall it was a really good time. One of the best visits, I would say, I experienced while being in LMC.
When I met Kara's mother in 1965 at this church camp, Episcopal church camp, it was the summer of the Watts riots in LA. And this Episcopal priest gave me a copy. There were only 3 black kids at the church camp. And I mean, how many black Episcopalians are there? You know, even in Washington, they ain't that many, let alone in West Virginia. So, he gave me a copy of James Baldwin's book. It's the first book I read by a black author. And I looked at the cover, and there was this black man looking at me. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, did he write the book? You know, I didn't black people could write. I mean, it's nobody ever told me they couldn't write, but I never read anything written by a black person. You know, I'd read Harry Beecher Stowe and Mark Twain and Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe. I loved Edgar Allan Poe. Guy de Maupassant, you know, A Piece of String, all this stuff. But I never read a black writer. And I read this book. I stayed up all night reading this book, and it just blew my mind. And I think I was hooked from that August 1965, deep down, that I knew my fantasy was that I wanted to be a writer. You know, I'm from a little tiny town in the hills of West Virginia. So I could read and be on Mars or in Africa or Russia or ancient Egypt. It's like being in a time machine. So I love reading. And then the idea, I realized that I didn't want to be a doctor. I really wanted to be a writer, but I didn't think I could be a great writer. And I wanted to be rich, and I wasn't going to be rich as a writer or a professor of English, please. My cousins and people would say, you went majored in English, anybody can do that. You're supposed to be a doctor. He said, do that on your own. Do that on the weekends. It was funny. I go, no, this is really what I want to do, but it took me a long time to admit that I wanted to be a professor. Somebody pays me to read and write books and to talk to smart people like you guys. Every day in my life, that's a fantasy. Now, I have done well financially, but not for my day job. You teach at Harvard, you have the highest salaries in the United States among college professors. So relatively speaking, you do well. But my friends who went to Wall Street, they make 1,000 times more money than I do. Not 1,000, 100, or 10, you know. So you make certain compromises. And I decided that I wanted to be comfortable, but I didn't really want to be fabulously, wealthy. That I wanted to do a job. When I was on my deathbed, I didn't want to say, I should have tried to write a novel or a screenplay. And I had to borrow a lot of money to go to Yale. I mean, I got a scholarship to go to Yale. I was thinking about this in another context recently. And when I went to Yale, the tuition was $3,200. Yeah, but that was a lot of money. My father made, during his whole work life at the paper mill, $128,000. Now, I ended up 4 years at Yale, and I had to borrow, they gave me a scholarship, so tuition and work was free, but I had to borrow all the money for all my living expenses, coming home and all that. I think I ended up, I must have borrowed, and then I went to graduate school and I borrowed money. So I probably borrowed $40,000 or $50,000. So I borrowed more than a third of my father's income, almost half of my father's income. And every penny was worth it. Because my choice was I could go to Yale or I could go to West Virginia University. And it was the right decision. Because if I hadn't gone to Yale, I wouldn't be sitting here today.
Everybody in the room, when they heard that, all their jaws kind of dropped. Everybody was completely surprised, especially my teacher, Mr. Williams. He kind of did all these very just quick gestures, like he was taken completely blindsided. It was really amazing to hear that, and I couldn't believe it. Like these people that I've studied in my class, like James Baldwin and Josephine Baker, and that he actually just sat down to dinner like they were his friends. Who does that? It was just incredible to hear that. I was so impressed.
My favorite writers are James Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston. Have you all read Zora Neale Hurston? And James Baldwin, did you ever read him?
Yes.
Yeah. And James Baldwin was the first gay writer I ever read. And I met him and interviewed him when I was 22 years old. Have you heard of Josephine Baker? Yes. Well, I did the last interview with Josephine Baker's life. I was 23. No, I was 22 years old, a month before my 23rd birthday. And I took Josephine Baker from her house in Monte Carlo to James Baldwin's house in San Paulo Vance near Nice. And my girlfriend and I rented a Peugeot and picked up Josephine Baker, who was just making a comeback. Huh? What's a Peugeot? Peugeot's a French car. P-E-U-G-O-T. And just a car. And I went to her house, and James Baldwin had told me to bring her back. It was about an hour's drive. And man, that was like dining with two gods, you know. It was bad, man. She'd come out of retirement, and she was going back on the stage. And when she went back on the stage, she died. She had a heart attack. But that night, Baldwin and a couple boyfriends who were there. I was with my girlfriend and Josephine Baker, and we ate and drank all night, man. And they talked about who they'd slept with, and who they wanted to sleep with, and who was zooming whom, and well, I don't know how y'all put it, man. It was wild to me. It was great. Because Baldwin was the first black writer I ever met.
During the interview, he talked a lot about his family and how they kind of really just helped him be like who he is. So I think that, I mean, I guess I've always known that families and people that people have grown up with have always provided a great kind of, been a big inspiration for who people turn out to be. But I'd never really known that, like all the details about Skip's life, and we found out a lot about his favorite readings, and I don't know, it was very eye-opening. He kind of became more of like, instead of like this person who I kind of have always, in a way, held him up as like a mentor and someone who's always been up above me. He was kind of more, it was like more like he's formed into a whole, full-rounded person with a history and kind of what he wants for his future and his kind of self now. So it was really just eye-opening.
But I love school, and I've never left school. I started school in September 1956, and I never have left. I think one of the reasons I became a professor was so I never had to leave school. It's true.